Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast Albanian Community Mental Health. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that's very important in our community, which is intergenerational trauma. And we have a special guest with us who will be introducing in 1 second. But this episode will be a little bit different in the sense that not only will be hearing from our guest, but we'll also be providing you with a lot of information on intergenerational trauma in general. So welcome.
We're joined here today by Norgenta Lata, who brings both professional insight and community understanding to this topic. And together, we're going to be exploring how trauma is passed down in generations, how it shows up in our everyday life, and then how we can begin to break some of these unhealthy cycles.
And we'll also touch a bit on themes of domestic violence, cultural silence, and also what healing can actually look like in this context. So, Ginta, welcome to our podcast. We're so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I get that we've known each other for a while now, so we're quite familiar with what you do and the advocacy work that you have in this community. But for our audience, could you please share a little bit about your background and the work that you're currently involved in?
Yes, of course. So I'm a clinical psychologist trainee and doctorate student studying clinical psychology. I'm also a qualified IDVA, which stands for Independent Domestic Violence Advocate. And I've just completing my ISVA qualification too, which is a sexual violence advocacy qualification. And both of those practices really complement my doctoral thesis that I'm working on now, which is focused on the examination of police responses to domestic abuse. And this is something that has continuously come up as an issue within my practice over the years. And now I'm using my academic research to explore this more so, hopefully with the aim of informing future policy change.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And, in addition to intergenerational trauma, we're also going to be touching a little bit on this topic of domestic violence. It's quite intertwined, even though the topics are different from each other. So we're going to be discussing them in context separately and of how they relate to each other. So, but just understanding a little bit more, how did you come to this path of being a psychologist? Could you kind of take us through the journey of what made you want to go down this path?
Yeah, so I think it stems from my desire to advocate for people. I would definitely say that that's a core value of mine in terms of advocating for those, particularly who are systematically disadvantaged, and helping them, especially within the healthcare field, helping them to overcome barriers of accessibility to treatment. And I feel that value has been pretty much shaped by my own cultural background, coming from a country that has experienced genocide within my lifetime, and continues to live with its impact years later. It's kind of this experience of injustice and wanting to do something to change it. And also, having worked in healthcare for most of my life, I've come to understand that the mental health system can sometimes re-traumatize individuals too, through principles of kind of control and coercion. And this led me to really question, how could I contribute to change? How could I utilize a position of power to create meaningful impact through both practice and within academia? I actually think there's a bit of a lack of awareness as to what it means to be a psychologist. Being a therapist is just one aspect of the role. A psychologist is a scientific practitioner, someone who identifies barriers and ongoing difficulties that are observed on the front line through clinical practice, and then works to facilitate change through research, which then can help inform and shape practice and policy. So the field of human rights was what was most kind of appealing to me. And I think that was a key reason as to why I wanted to pursue a career in psychology.
I really, really loved how you made the distinction between like a therapist versus a psychologist in the work that we do, because those terms really are used interchangeably. And I think people don't realize how much more there is to psychology and how therapy is only one branch of it. So I really loved that explanation. When I first came across your work, it was actually through social media. I just discovered your Psych Resources social media page, and then we started following each other, and one thing led to another. And I thought the psych resources and the work that you're doing there is so, so cool. So, just a little bit of background for our audience. So, Gainta writes a lot of children's books on mental health, which are available through the psych resources website. And what was really cool is that there's a specific book on intergenerational trauma in Albanian as well, which makes it so much more accessible to our community. But can you tell us a little bit on how you went from doing a doctoral degree in psychology, which is already very time consuming, very hard to do, plus doing this on the side? What inspired it, and what are you hoping to achieve through psych resources?
Yeah, so it really stemmed from one book initially, and that was a book titled Standing Up to the Anxiety Monster. And this book came about from the work I was doing very early on in my career, which was teaching anxiety management sessions in schools to children as young as 5 years old. But unfortunately, at the time when I was teaching those sessions, they were reserved for a small number of children per class. And that was because of the lack of funding within our National Health Service. And I remember at the time thinking that it was such a shame that so many children were missing out on learning the basic skills of emotional literacy. So that was initially what had planted the seed. And then we had the pandemic, and we saw a rise in anxiety amongst children and adolescents. And the statistics here in the UK were really, and I suspect they're very similar in Canada too, they were very shocking. You know, 1 in 5 children was being were being diagnosed with a mental health problem. So it was very clear to me then that the mental well-being of children and of young people, it has to be the priority. And at the time, because it was the pandemic, I was working very long hours in healthcare. And the time that I did have, I was using to create these resources for children. And they were all based on the anxiety management sessions that I used to teach, that then developed into the anxiety management workbook, which then led to the creation of many other workbooks too. And what I really wanted the books to do is just to kind of teach children the basic skills of emotional literacy, to be able to identify emotions, to learn ways to regulate them. Because I really think that teaching children it's a form of early intervention. It's quite literally crime prevention, it's suicide prevention, and ultimately just the foundations of a more kind of healthier society.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting interplay of, teaching children and working into how generational trauma could be related to this. I specifically like how you mentioned that, we're seeing rates of mental health diagnoses go up in the recent times. And this is a conversation that I've had with a few of my colleagues, comparing, for example, a few decades ago versus now. Could it be that the society that we're building is leading young people or children towards more diagnoses in different mental health disorders? Or was it simply that we didn't have the means to diagnose individuals a while ago to really understand what is happening with children at that time? Because maybe some of that behavior that we were seeing in children a while ago was considered normal. And this is how intergenerational trauma plays really well into this, because this is exactly why this term exists, is that, trauma has been passed down from parents to children kind of unknowingly, mostly because that behavior was seen as normal and it was tolerated. It was not seen as problematic, and perhaps not even seen how it could affect someone's mental health because people don't talk about or didn't used to talk about these things before. So it ties in really well, I believe. And I also, it's a core value of mine as well to kind of prevent mental health disorders from even forming in this way, like you said, to target children early on and to teach them these skills so that we could eliminate or just decrease, at the very least, the passing on of these traumatic patterns.
And I remember being in grad school myself and doing like the PhD and like learning about emotions and how to regulate emotions and the different tools. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, like, imagine how much better off we would have been, or at least I would
Hmm.
have been, had I had these tools when I was younger. Because I think it can really build this buffer from any kind of like mental health conditions that someone might struggle in like later on because they already have the tools to manage them. over there. So I think prevention is so, so key. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Albanian book that you wrote, Probalium and Prevention and Agdit, which I love that title, by the way. And I'm so excited to actually read it to my daughter when she's old enough. But can you tell us a little bit about that book and when it will be appropriate for parents to read it with their children and what the intention behind writing that book was?
Absolutely. So the book was initially created in English and then was translated into Albanian by a charity that I work with in Kosovo. It's the Ideas Partnership charity, which is just an amazing charity. And the reason why I wanted to bring this into the Albanian and Kosovo sphere was because I found it quite shocking how taboo of a topic mental health is, considering our history and the social and political context that shaped our culture, because we are a culture that has experienced communism, genocide, violence, and oppression throughout so many years. And one where, as you said, intergenerational trauma is prevalent. Yet I don't feel that the statistics on mental health within our culture are a true reflection of people's lived experience. I would actually say they are lower than expected. And that's not because they don't exist, it's because people don't talk about it. We know there are various factors reinforcing that cycle: shame, fear, all perpetuating the stigma. But what happens is that then the next generation learn to respond in the same way, because children learn by watching what adults do and not necessarily by listening to what we tell them to do. And so
Mhm.
when we model certain behaviors such as not talking openly about difficulties and their impact, what happens is that children then learn to respond in this same way. They learn to keep quiet when they face adversities, and then that cycle continues as we see within our own community. And so I truly believe that education can break that cycle. And that's why I felt it was incredibly important to bring these teachings in Albanian. Because if we are teaching the next generation these skills, then we're essentially building them up to change cultural norms. And going back to your question about what I'd hope to achieve with the book, I really hope that the book facilitates policy change. The aim is essentially to implement mental health education within the school curriculum, both in Kosovo and Shibri, which has been a very long process, but one that I am very much determined to see to the end. I've had amazing support from the Embassy of Kosovo here in London, and we have an amazing ambassador, Zotrelia Kapite, who is really behind it. Because once it is incorporated within the education system, it's sending out a message. What we're doing is we're normalizing the conversation around mental health, because teaching about it means talking about it, which in itself just diminishes that shame and secrecy around such an important yet taboo topic. But what I also want to stress is that talking isn't enough. It's the first and probably most important step, I'd say, but it's what we do with that moving forward. It's the learning of the emotion regulation skills, because that's what's going to be key in shaping sense of self and future relationships as well.
There are definitely steps, hierarchical steps towards healing. And first and foremost, I'm an advocate for awareness. I think without awareness, there's very little that we can do. So like you said, exposing children really early on to what anxiety even is, how it can show up, would help them identify anxiety patterns in their own life so that they could just be aware that it's even happening before they take steps towards healing or, ameliorating those symptoms. And the shame aspect of it is really big in our community, especially, I think, worldwide for sure, because mental health stigma is still something that exists. We all live in Western countries, all three of us at the moment. So here it's a little bit more normalized, but have to keep in mind that in most of the world, mental health stigma is very much alive, not only for children, but, everywhere, including, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, domestic violence, which is one of the most prevalent forms of violence within a family and a household. And you mentioned as well that you're qualified as an IDVA or IDVA, which stands for Independent Domestic Violence Advisor, right? Could you explain a little bit more about what this means and how this could relate to the research that you're doing?
I think actually to answer this question, I think it's first important to talk about where that came about. One of the most pivotal roles I had in my career up until now was working in a women's crisis house here in London. And my manager at the time, her name was Shirley McNicholas, truly embodied what it meant to be a trauma-informed advocate. And having her as a role model was very much a turning point for me. It's what led me to qualify as an IDVA and an ISVA. And more so, those roles exist to essentially advocate for people to have a more of a deeper understanding of the laws and the policies surrounding these crimes, and then use that to empower survivors that you come into contact with within the system, and in my case, with the healthcare system. And my experience was a major factor in shaping the focus of my doctoral research, particularly my interest in police responses to domestic abuse, because domestic abuse is a prevalent societal issue that disproportionately affects women globally. So this is not specific to the Albanian community. And when I looked into the research around police responses, I found that in the UK, we had various reports identifying it as a priority in police and crime plans. However, I also found that many frontline officers, and in some cases, even specialist police officers, really lack the skills to tackle domestic abuse appropriately and in a trauma informed manner. And I also don't think that's limited to the UK either. It is very much a global issue. Overall, there is limited research on police responses to domestic abuse, particularly in the context of AI technologies and technology based abuse as well. Um, and because our lives are so increasingly intertwined with digital technologies, it really does represent a significant and growing area of concern. And so, what I'm hoping to do is to fill this gap with my research to inform policy change. And the ultimate goal with that would be to include technology facilitated domestic abuse within the Domestic Abuse Act policy in the UK, and then for future research to formulate guidelines of best practice and how to respond to this more specifically.
That's a very ambitious PhD
Yes.
project. And I really think it's important. So, a lot of the work that I do clinically is in trauma work, and we do see a lot of high rates of domestic abuse. And it is one of those areas where people are scared to come forward because it's happening within the families. And especially in our community, people are scared to come forward because of that idea of shame. They don't want to say something that could harm someone else like within the family. And because we're such a shame-based culture, it makes a lot of sense that sort of like wanting to protect your family comes at sometimes at the expense of like the individual. So I really commend you for taking on such an ambitious PhD project, because doing a PhD is very hard in and of itself, and doing it in this area is that much harder. But it's such important work that you're doing.
I completely agree in the sense that, you know, we believe that domestic violence only comes, a lot of people believe that it only comes in the form of physical violence, but it actually exists in many forms. We think of physical abuse as the primary, but because it's the most life threatening aspect of domestic violence, but it can exist, for example, in many kinds of behaviors that are considered abuse. It could be verbal abuse, name calling, constant put downs, yelling, swearing, anything that can invoke fear in an individual. Could be emotional abuse, maybe withholding emotional support, neglect in an emotional way, not connecting emotionally as a couple or as a family. Even financial abuse in some cases where an individual is being withheld financial freedom so that they are dependent on the abuser. So there are many ways that it could show up. And if the public, can understand the different ways that abuse is controlling the relationship, perhaps they're more likely to see themselves in that situation and more likely to report and seek help as well. But we know that there are a lot of barriers. As Ariela mentioned, shame is a big one when it comes to this. So what do you believe in our community and maybe in the community at large are some of the most obvious or more targetable barriers when it comes to people seeking support?
I think it's important to acknowledge the barriers that persist at both the community level and the wider structural systems. Within our communities, and you lightly touched on this, Adelia, we have a code of honor, which obviously can be incredibly helpful in terms of maintaining collectivism and maintaining our community values. And it's definitely a real strength within our culture and very prominent in other cultures too. However, it can be extremely harmful and detrimental too, because with honor comes expectations and control. And when we step outside of what our community has considered as honourable, for example, leaving a family unit or speaking out about abuse, it's something that's then met with a lot of stigma and shame. Because how many times have we heard the word mara or tor growing up? These terms are very much deeply embedded in the cultural language that many of us have grown up hearing, almost to the point where we don't question it as much anymore. And in the context of Albanian communities, societal stigma is a significant setback because the shame that has historically and continues to be wrongfully placed on survivors, people have been blamed, silenced, rejected for what has been perpetrated against them. And then we have our broader, more structural barriers like lack of culturally sensitive services that are available, or language barriers and mistrust of institutions, which can then further discourage people from accessing support. And that's why I'm so grateful for the service that you have set up, because that services like those really help overcome these barriers of accessibility. Because whilst many kind of practitioners and clinicians promote this idea of cultural humility, I I feel like it's not enough to be in the room and show humility. Vicky Reynolds, who I'm thinking about now, is a scholar that I really admire, and she talks about this quite a lot, and says that we can't just come up and show, we can't be in the room and just show cultural humility. We have to be culturally informed, or at least informed to an extent so that trust and psychological safety can be built, especially for communities like ours who can be extremely distrusting of services because of our historical context of violence and oppression. And so, in that sense, rapport and psychological safety is paramount.
One of the things I was actually thinking about as you were speaking, especially about the role of culture, is how sometimes very problematic behaviors are normalized like within our culture. So then I think because it's so normalized, because everyone quote unquote goes through it, then it's that much harder to identify abuse when it's happening. And I think in our code of honor, so we talk a lot about like the Kanun law and some of these systems that go back centuries and centuries and are so ingrained in our culture. And yes, they did reflect the values of the time when they were developed. I think, especially, violence towards women and centuries in the past, it was very normalized. So the Kanun was kind of reflecting those world values when it was written at the time. And I think now sticking to some of these codes of honor, it's a little bit outdated because now we know that, hey, certain ways of approaching discipline within the family are actually quite problematic. They really impact the individual they're traumatic. They impact an individual at their very core. They really worsen their mental health. They increase rates of self harm. They increase rates of suicide. And I think because we've followed these systems for as long as we have, there's like a hesitancy in giving them up. And the systems in and of itself, they need to be updated in order for to create like a healthier culture, both physically and mentally, I think, for everyone. And I think sometimes we shy away from critiquing some of these cultural systems, which I think is the goal that we're trying to do with like this podcast and the work that we're doing through ACMH and the work that some of the research that we're doing as well. So I think it's really important that we just start having more conversations and looking at both what is serving us from the cultural systems and also what needs to be changed because it's actually causing us harm.
I completely agree. And I think updating, I guess, to kind of summarize what you were describing, is to update the mentality. And with that comes a lot of adjustment to the way that the modern world functions, not just in terms of what we are believing at the moment that is different from what we used to believe in the past, but also how we address these things, like the policy changes that Genta mentioned before, but even just the way that we are functioning in society. Excuse me. For women, for example, the fear of social isolation was the biggest perpetrator of staying in a domestic violence, exposing, like you said, or exposing the violence within the family comes with a lot of consequences, and social exclusion is one of our biggest fears as a society. If I always like to go back to how we were evolutionarily developed until now, is that social exclusion is a deep primal fear that people have, because if you were left alone, you had very little means to survive. So for women especially, this fear evolved throughout the years, because at some points of in history, and in some places even now, women are not able to sustain themselves financially without the help of a male counterpart, for example. And if we're talking about domestic violence against women, but when considering domestic violence against both men and women, the threat of social exclusion in general is a deep fear. So social exclusion from society because of the shame that comes with domestic violence, possible social exclusion from the family unit itself, the extended family, because of the image that it brings to the family and the shame that comes along with that. So we try really hard to avoid this kind of primitive fear that we have. And for many people, being alone or the uncertainty that arises when you think about how you might be making ends meet without a partner is much scarier than tolerating or learning how to survive in an abusive relationship.
Yeah. And I just want to add one thing too, because what I notice in our community is that there's a little bit of a hesitancy to talk about change. And whether we can see that change will be good in some areas, I think it feels very threatening to talk about change. And I think a big part of that is because the cultural systems that we have in place, they have protected us through the years. I think the reason that why we're so tied together as a community is because shame as an emotion kind of keeps us behaving in a certain way that we get accepted by the community. And if we are part of this larger community, then we're stronger. We can survive genocides, we can survive wars, we can survive famines, we can survive a lot of things. And in our community, there's been a lot of things, a lot of traumatic events that have been thrown our way. So the more that we see, hey, being part of this community is actually protecting us, the scarier it's going to be to actually make changes to the systems that we feel are protecting us. So even though sometimes we see, hey, the research shows this, we need to be doing things differently, that idea of change feels very terrifying at almost like a very biological, very physical level, which we'll talk a bit more about. Since we're on the topic, Inda, maybe I can ask you a little bit about how domestic violence actually intersects with intergenerational trauma, which we'll spend a lot more time talking about today.
I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about the trauma of domestic abuse, we need to understand it systemically, because experiences of domestic abuse are a form of oppression, and they often shape the meanings that people make of their experiences, as well as the behaviors that they might adopt in order to survive and keep themselves either physically or psychologically safe. But it's these behaviors, these safety behaviors, that can have an unintended consequences. So, for example, a person who has experienced domestic abuse may become highly vigilant to signs of conflict. They might adopt a pattern of avoiding disagreement altogether. They might suppress their own emotions, avoid expressing anger or distress, because conflict has previously been associated with danger. And neurologically, our brains are very much wired through these associations. So these beliefs, these patterns, whether they're spoken or unspoken, can be transmitted across generations. And so the impact of domestic abuse extends beyond the individual and can very much become embedded within family systems. And I think that's how domestic abuse can intersect with intergenerational trauma, not only through direct exposure, but through survival strategies, through the meanings, the relational patterns that the next generation then learn over time. But I do want to say that that is just a simple example. It's much more complex than that. And I want to be very careful to not place any blame on parents or shame them in any way, because, like I said, this is a systemic issue. And I also want to acknowledge that feelings of the shame and self-blame that are experienced by survivors of domestic abuse, they are often perpetuated by dominant discourses around gender and misogyny that tend to pathologize and blame women, especially for their own victimization. So while intergenerational patterns can and do develop, it is crucial to recognize that they do stem from much broader structural and social context. These experiences don't begin within the individual or the family alone. They're very much shaped by larger systems of power and cultural narratives. think it's important to say that as well.
Yeah, I think we definitely need some updating in terms of what it means to be a man in our culture and what it means to be a woman in our culture, because some of these templates that we have, I don't think that they serve the function that they're intending to right now. And they're causing more harm than good at this point. So for the second part of this podcast, Ada, Genta, and we've been doing a lot of research and creating a paper, something that we call like a narrative review on defining intergenerational trauma within our community, looking at the research on it. And so we wanted to kind of give a sneak peek of what the paper is going to be about in this episode. We're also going to have a lot more episodes later on about intergenerational trauma. But today we just wanted to provide an overview of what intergenerational trauma is, how does it get transmitted from one generation to the next, just so we can understand it more within the context of our community. So I want to start a little bit by providing the historical background of intergenerational trauma. So I think in Albania or Kosovo or Macedonia, any Albanian community all over the world, one of the things that really ties us together, aside from the culture, aside from the language, I think is like some of the things that we've experienced as a community. And we can go as far back as the Ottoman Empire. We were colonized for 500 years. Somehow we managed to preserve our language, preserve our culture, which is amazing considering how long we were colonized for. And during the Ottoman Empire, we hear a lot of traumatic events during that time. A lot of people were forced to assimilate. A lot of people had their children taken away from them. So Skanderbeu, for example, is a really popular a figure in our community. And one of the things that really stands out about that story is, as a family, having your children taken away from you and you not being able to do anything about it, having to practice some of these cultural traditions in silence because the consequences would be very severe. Even though we eventually gained our freedom, it was through one colonization after another. So I think as in terms of like Albania or like the greater Albania area, it's been colonized by the Germans, there was Serbians, there was Italians, I think we were colonized by Vienna at some point. So throughout history, all we've known for the past centuries and centuries is violence, is war, is genocide, and living with this idea that at any time our freedom or our lives or the things that are truly important to us can be taken away at any point. And then even later on within our history, so there was the Chameria genocide that happened, there was a Kosovo genocide that happened to more specific communities within our larger community. There was communism that happened, so living in silence for years and years and not being able to say anything to question the government, otherwise your life was in danger. And then even post-communism, there was a civil war in Albania that happened. There was the mass immigration, and I hear a lot of stories about how difficult like the immigration process actually was because they were going to these countries experiencing a lot of discrimination, experiencing a lot of racism, something that actually is still present to this day around the world. So all of these experiences together, when we talk about trauma, we talk about, at least in Canada, we have like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. I think in Europe it's the ICD, the International Classification Diagnostic System. And the way that we define trauma is sort of like one dangerous event that can happen in someone's lifetime. And as a community, we've had one dangerous event after another, after another, after another. And so when we talk about mental health, we can't actually ignore the cumulative effects of all of these events and what they've had in our community. So it's really important to acknowledge the historical context. And when I work with clients, I always bring up the historical context because we can't start treating mental health unless we acknowledge the things that we've gone through, not only during our lifetimes, but throughout the last 6 or 7 centuries at this point, and how they've shaped us as a community, how they've shaped how we relate to one another, how they've shaped how we show up in our families and what happens in those families, and what causes us harm and what is making us like truly resilient.
The way I would define intergenerational trauma is the passing down of experiences, narratives, ways of responding to other people that, as you say, have been shaped by social, cultural, political pressures. It's not just about what has happened to one person. It's about how those experiences live on in families, in our communities, often showing up in behaviors, our beliefs, and our emotional responses across generations.
So intergenerational trauma can show up in many different ways in how we interact with each other, or even just how we feel internally. One of the ways that it could show, I'll list a few of the different ways that you might relate to. And one of the ways that it could show up is, for example, having a much bigger reaction to a minor situation than is expected of that situation. For example, one might experience intense fear or anger or shame or anxiety in situations that on the surface, as they are, don't fully explain or warrant that emotional intensity that the person is expressing. And often what happens in these situations is that reaction, that kind of, relatively blown up reaction, is not connected only to the present moment, but it's an accumulation of generations of survival fear, instability, silence that our people have experienced that haven't been fully processed within the family system. And so it gets translated into kind of smaller situations. Right. Another way could be that when a person's belief about the world is shaped by more than what they were taught, or more than their direct experiences. For example, if you're growing up and you're hearing messages like don't trust other people, or don't tell other people about what's going on in the house, or what will other people think about what's happening here, this could really impact how you relate to somebody else outside of your family unit. It could impact what you think about safety and how to express emotions and being vulnerable. So even if you yourself have not lived through those traumatic events that require silence and mistrust in others, hearing it within the family unit could then perpetuate your own belief about how you relate to society as a whole. And this would lead really nicely into the topic of hypervigilance, right? So hypervigilance is when you're expecting something bad to happen, even if there's no external evidence that anything bad could happen. And some people, for example, it could show up in different ways that are not necessarily physically harmful situations. For example, individuals that feel a constant pressure to succeed, to protect the family image, to help their family survive, and any kind of mistake that could happen towards that path of succeeding and helping the family survive could feel extremely scary, really unsafe, because then this would mean that the family is unsafe if you are not succeeding in the way that you believe that you will be succeeding. So people carry this deep sense of responsibility for their family. They're hypervigilant about opportunities around them. They feel like they have to sacrifice themselves or hold everybody together in fear of disappointing other people. And I believe that in diaspora communities specifically, this can be even more complicated in younger generations that feel caught between the two cultures and feeling that they need to provide for their family as a whole. And in our community, trauma can show up, for example, through silence, avoiding different family histories like communism and war and migration and things that Arela mentioned before. But children still absorb that emotional atmosphere that is created in the family. So even if you don't actively talk about these things, the people inside the family unit could learn fear and tension and mistrust and shame without really understanding where those emotional responses are coming from. So other people might struggle to express their emotions openly because of that emotional suppression being normalized is like a survival strategy across generations. But the important thing about when we speak about how intergenerational trauma could show up is that, it's not only a cognitive process or an emotional process, it could show up physically as well. This is a very important aspect of psychology, is that sometimes people have physical aches, instead of naming emotions in terms of I'm anxious or I'm depressed, they could talk about having headaches or chronic back pain or stomach and digestion issues, or just always being exhausted, for example. So in many cultures, including our culture, emotional distress can be carried through the body and we might not be really aware of what's happening. But I want to end this off by saying that these patterns are decades long, centuries long, as Arela mentioned, because of the history that we've gone through. And they're ways of coping that our ancestors have developed in really difficult environments and situations that they have to go through. So the goal of understanding intergenerational trauma is not to blame previous generations, but to understand how these experiences are shaping us now in the way that we show up and the way that our families and society is currently being formed so that we can choose the targets that we want to change as we carry them.
And we also want to be mindful too that nothing is either all good or all bad. So some of the same systems that kept us safe and protected us for centuries and centuries and allowed us to survive for centuries and centuries, these are the same systems that right now, when we are experiencing a little bit more safety than we have in the past, now might actually be hindering us. And finally, we start to see the signs of some of these traumatic events. Because the way it works with trauma is when we're in survival mode, a lot of these behaviors, a lot of these thoughts, a lot of these emotional patterns, they're actually quite adaptive. They help us get through the situation, they keep us safe. And we actually don't see sort of like the effect that the trauma has had until we're actually safe. And I think as a community, we've reached a point where, again, we are safer at least than we've been in the past. And now we're starting to see the consequence of all of these centuries and centuries of traumatic events that have happened. So I know in this episode, we're using a lot of technical terms because these are really complicated systems to explain. So we created this infographic just to simplify it a little bit in terms of the different methods of transmission of trauma. And we'll take some time going through each one just so we can really understand that it's not really one thing that the parents are doing or one thing that the community is doing. It actually comes up in all these different ways. So I like to talk a little bit about the stories and the way that we talk about painful events that we've gone through in our families and in our communities. And one thing that I notice is, and actually, psychologist Mimosa Gashi, we had her on the podcast as well, as she talked a little bit about the impact of the war in the Kosovar community. And she did a really wonderful job at explaining it, how the way that we talk about painful events that we've gone through actually impact us. And one of the things that I want to quote her on is this idea that we talk about the facts, but we don't leave room to actually process the emotions. So even when we're talking about what the families have gone through, we sort of rely on just not talking about painful events altogether. So in my own family, I'm sure there's things that my parents have gone through that they just never mention. They kind of hint at it every once in a while, but they never mention in terms of what happened. Or you get told the story with all of these traumatic details, but then the parents or the community doesn't allow the space for you to actually process the emotions around it, which I think is very hard because, as you can imagine, parents are stuck between two ideas. Either we protect the child and we actually don't talk about the trauma at all in order to protect the child, so we're not scaring them. Or we want to give the child the context. We want to know that we want to teach a child how to keep themselves safe. So we need to actually tell them the stories. But then we ourselves haven't emotionally processed the story, so then we don't know how to actually help the child process it as we're telling it to them as well. And there is something that is called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is when we haven't experienced these events directly. Rather, we hear about these events happening to people that we are close to, or we're exposed to a lot of these details as part of a job. For example, first responders, or trauma therapists, they get exposed to all of these details of really painful things happening. And sometimes that can be enough to actually impact us emotionally, impact our mental health, or it can lead to post traumatic stress disorder. So we can use the concept of vicarious trauma to see how sometimes the way that we talk about these stories, being exposed to the details, and not just by our parents, I want to say, I think in our community, we talk a lot about the events that have happened to us, about really painful things that have happened to us. So sometimes even being exposed to these details is enough to actually cause PTSD. So again, this isn't to say that parents shouldn't talk about these things with their kids. This isn't to say that we as a community can't talk about painful things that have happened to us, because absolutely knowing our history is really important when it comes to healing and recovery, and also making sure that we're preventing things from happening again. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I really like that saying. So the history part is important. We just need to talk about it in a way where we're also opening space to process the emotions around it in order to minimize the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. And a little bit on the biology and physiology piece of trauma transmission. It could show up in the way that our systems evolve through time, through the genes that we get from our parents. We are made up physically of the people that came before us. So not only does trauma affect us emotionally, it can affect our body and our nervous system. So when generations live through traumatic events, as we mentioned before, the body then adapts into a survival mode system where, the hormones that are released, for example, or the way that the muscles evolve and are tensed are adaptive to the situation that the individuals are going through. And then this influences how people respond to stress and danger and safety. And research even suggests that prolonged trauma could shape all the stress related biology systems, not even in the individual, but then how it gets passed on to their children. So sometimes younger generations that are not in these immediate threatening situations could also carry a heightened sensitivity to any kind of minor stressful situations. And this could show up like hypervigilance or like multiple disorders that we've seen: anxiety, depression, and overreactive stress responses, without really realizing where those patterns are originating from, because they're not proportional to the situation at hand. So the body is a very important aspect of this that we don't often consider. But our brain and our body are interconnected. Everything works as a system. So to disregard the lower part of our physiology doesn't make sense. I think it should be all integrated when we think about how trauma can show up.
If I can add to that a bit of a personal experience as well, I remember taking my first stress and psychology class in undergrad and being absolutely mind blown of how our emotions can actually influence us physically. And it was the first time in my life that I heard, hey, like these emotions, these things that we're feeling, they actually leave physical traces. They activate our fight or flight system. They shape our nervous system in a certain way. And I just remember being completely mind blown because I'd never considered before then that emotions are actually a physical response. They're not just something abstract the way that we get taught about in our community. Like emotions are, all the way over there, or maybe a little bit like in the mind, but we don't see how it affects like the whole body as well. So it's really cool how much like this affects us like physiologically, and also how it gets passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah, I agree. It's completely intertwined. And, we see, for example, we know colloquially adrenaline. We hear how adrenaline can show up when we're really in dangerous situations, for example, or cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So if you imagine someone who is in a constant threat situation, like war or communism, those are very anxiety inducing survival type situations. Their physical body will then adapt to a higher baseline of hormonal release. So to them, one small situation could trigger a very large hormonal release. So having a new baseline will then, when these individuals eventually reproduce, that higher level of baseline would then translate into the children as well. So this is a physical way in which intergenerational trauma is passed on.
So cognitions. Cognitions is a word that we use a lot in therapeutic practice, but it's just a fancy word. It's essentially just means thoughts. So our thoughts or our beliefs. And as we mentioned earlier, trauma is the passing down of intergenerational trauma, shall I say, is the passing down of experiences, narratives, and ways of responding to people that then shapes how we think. It shapes our beliefs about ourselves, how we see other people, how we connect with others, and ultimately how we see the world. So if we were to use an example here, an Albanian person who has had parents who've lived through a violent and oppressive communist regime, for example, as many people have, may have developed coping behaviors such as isolating, maybe not getting too close to people, being mistrusting. And this can really manifest into beliefs such as, I have to protect myself because other people can't fully be trusted and the world can be a dangerous place. Now, that's just one example, and some people may relate to that and some may not. It all depends on individual context. And whilst I think it's important to say that whilst we all have a shared history, it also doesn't mean that everyone is going to react in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the treatments that we use a lot that uses both cognition and emotion is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's this idea of how our beliefs can also shape our emotions, which brings us to how intergenerational trauma gets transmitted through emotional patterns as well. So in our culture, one of the things that I notice a lot, and I have these conversations with a lot of Albanian clients, is that certain emotions are okay. Other emotions, we don't talk about it, we don't think about it, we don't feel it, we push them away. So anger is totally okay in our society. I think most of our emotions get expressed through anger. So we're okay with calling people out. We're okay with being very assertive. I think, Genta, you mentioned before, and we've talked about this a lot in our podcast, how a lot of us grow up with a sense of like injustice. We see all of these horrible things happening around us. And then through anger, we use that emotion to actually make changes. And anger is a really powerful emotion when it comes to motivating us to make the changes that we need to make something just, to make something fair, to achieve a goal that is currently being blocked. The problem becomes when we only express our emotions through anger because that is the only culturally accepted emotion to show. In our culture, we don't show sadness. We don't show anxiety. We don't show when we're suffering in other ways. Even love, sometimes there's very clear rules in terms of when we're allowed to show love towards someone versus when we're not. And a lot of these emotions, if we were to show them, they're seen as like a sign of weakness in our community. Now, how does this affect us? Well, we know that emotion suppression, so the more that we stuff down our emotions, the more it actually creates a physical load. So, talking about the biology aspect of it, it requires a lot of energy for our nervous system to be able to push down emotions. And it requires a lot of cognitive energy. So, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that's responsible for thinking and planning and those thoughts that Ganta just mentioned, that area of the brain is working overtime just to push down those emotions. And we know that if we do this on a prolonged basis, so for years and years and years, it's associated with autoimmune condition, it's associated with chronic pain conditions, it's associated with things like fibromyalgia. So there's a high cost that comes with suppressing our emotions. Now, in times of traumatic events, in times of war, in times of communism, we did need to suppress our emotions. It wasn't safe enough to actually feel them. We couldn't fall apart and cry because we had to feed our children. We had to get ourselves out of danger. We didn't have the luxury to be able to show any other emotion. But then what happens is that if generation after generation, none of them have actually learned how to feel these emotions because it hasn't been safe, we've reached a generation where now, even if it is safe to feel our emotions, we don't have the capacity to do so because it's never been taught to us. And the consequences of doing that are heightened risk of mental health conditions and heightened risk of physical health conditions as well. So a lot of the work that I do with clients when it comes to emotions is learning how to feel them, learning how to sit with them without avoiding them, and learning actually how to use language to express emotions other than anger, other than the emotion that has been the most dominant one in our culture for so long. And again, that anger, we needed the anger to be there. Anger is the thing that's kept us safe for centuries and centuries. Anger is the reason why we preserved our culture, we preserved our language through all of these atrocities that were committed. Anger is the reason why a lot of Albanians are very successful all over the world because it leads to more ambition, it leads to creating change, and it's the emotion that right now might be holding us back at the same time, especially when we don't give all the other emotions that we have a chance to actually process.
And as well, moving on to the cultural aspect of our community, we have an amazing culture. I think we are very proud, very patriotic of the way that we express our culture as well. We have beautiful customs and rituals and ways of relating to each other that are sometimes shared, sometimes very specific to smaller communities or even within families. There are little rituals that I have within my family that I check with Ariela or Genta, and I say, do you guys do this as well? And it's not always shared, which is what makes it so special because there are some commonalities with how we express these rituals, but they we make it our own. And I think this is a really beautiful piece of our community. We have such pride in our culture that we have cultivated over generations and generations. And some of those qualities of our culture involve family loyalty, which is a really big one. Hospitality is really huge in our culture, the way that we treat guests and that how we express our gratitude to our family who visits us and other guests as well. But it could also show up as a culture of endurance of all of the things that we've experienced throughout the years, of protecting our family because of all the things that we've experienced throughout the years. These are all really powerful sources for resilience and the way that we connect to each other. At the same time, some of these patterns that have evolved throughout the year in our culture are actually developed as survival strategies. So, for example, silence around suffering or restraining your emotions in favor of expressing them because it's safer. Which is something that, if we could pinpoint an exact situation, like Arela mentioned previously, relates really closely to communism because it was unsafe to express. So, prioritizing family, the image of the family over your own individual needs, these are all tied into the way that we practice and express our culture, which can unintentionally carry this unresolved pain that we have over the years and throughout our generation. So even though we have beautiful practices, they are intertwined with the way that we relate to each other. So finding out what we want to preserve from our cultural practices, what we want to carry forward through the generations, and what we want to leave behind because they could be harmful in certain situations is good insight to have as well.
Absolutely. So, this is just a quick summary in terms of how everything ties together, how we as a community have been passing down certain things that are impacting our mental health to this day. So, what is next? How do we break the cycle? How do we actually heal from this concept of intergenerational trauma? And this is where things actually get really tricky. And it gets tricky because intergenerational trauma is a concept that is just now being talked about and being researched. So we actually don't have really good treatments that are evidence-based the same way that we do for things like generalized anxiety or depression or some of these things that have been more researched throughout the years. The other problem is that in our community, we actually don't have a lot of treatments that we know work for the things that we've gone through for our community. And the reason for that is because there's been no research done. Again, we've been in survival mode for centuries. Only now are we starting to see this is how these things affect us, and these are some of the things that we can do to improve. So I wanted to talk a little bit about these two caveats in there because that is part of why we're doing the research that we're doing and why we're doing this podcast is that we are trying to understand it and then put it out there so then other people can also help learn and understand it for themselves and know how to heal from this as well. I had someone in my family recently ask me, "Do you think that everyone needs to be in therapy?" And I thought about it for a minute and I was like, no, not everyone needs to be in therapy. There's people who have had pretty safe lives who aren't really struggling with any mental health conditions, who maybe they'll go through something in life that they'll need therapy in, but they might not necessarily need therapy. And I think every Albanian needs therapy. And the reason that I'm saying this is just because of the things that we've gone through in life. I think not just our generation, not the things that have happened in our lifetimes, but the things that have happened for centuries and centuries that still affect us, that it is helpful to meet with a therapist to explore what does this look like for me? How did this actually show up in my family? What are some things that have been normalized in my family and in my culture that are actually causing me harm that I need to change for myself? What are some of the things that have actually helped me in my family in terms of resilience and that I need to continue practicing? and how to be able to differentiate between the two. And not only that, but what are the things that I've gone through in life, whether a lot of us are first generation immigrants, for example. Just the process of immigration alone is something that can be quite traumatic. So, what are the things that have happened in my lifetime? Has there been a war? Has there been immigration? Has there been some other type of event that has significantly impacted me? If you are a second generation, I would say, what was it like growing up between two cultures where at home you had to be one version of yourself and somewhere else you had to be another version of yourself? And what is the impact that this has had on me? How has it shaped my emotions? How has it shaped the way that I think about the world? How does it has it shaped my behaviors and the way that I show up in these situations, and what is causing me harm and what needs to change instead? So there isn't a certain treatment that at this point we can give you in terms of if you do this, you'll be cured from intergenerational trauma, because that doesn't exist, but it is up to the individual. And I would really encourage seeking support with a trauma-informed counselor, and even harder to find, but thankfully in our community we're growing, someone who understands like the role of the culture, someone who understands the history. They don't necessarily need to be Albanian, because Albanian therapists are really hard to come by, even though the community is growing, but at least they need to be able to understand the culture enough, understand the history enough to be able to work effectively with you. And for anyone out there who is struggling to find like a therapist, get in touch with us. We're happy to look up like resources in your area. You know, we're only licensed in like the small part of the jurisdiction that we practice in. So it's not like we can see clients globally, but we're happy to match you with any resources that you need. So feel free to reach out at any time.
Yeah. Can I go back to what you were saying earlier about the difficulties with breaking cycles? Because I think that was really beautifully put. And it just reminded me of, I listened to your last episode with Ermal Dautay, who spoke about the freak parajikimes. And I guess I just wanted to build up on that because you've reminded me of something there. I think it's important to say that it's often difficult to break these cycles because they're so deeply embedded, and they can feel very normal and very familiar. And in some cases, they're even just necessary for survival. And many of those patterns were developed as a way of coping, which is what you said, in response to like difficult or unsafe environments. And they're not always, as you said, conscious within our conscious awareness. And so we don't always feel like it needs to be challenged because we don't necessarily know that they're there. But with that lack of awareness, if something has been passed down across generations, it can be difficult to then, recognize them as a pattern. And we just kind of accept that this is the way things are. And on top of that, and I think you mentioned this earlier as well, we often have these kind of powerful emotions like loyalty, guilt, or fear that are in line with our code of honor, which then makes it more difficult to question it or challenge family dynamics. But as you said, without safe spaces or without a safe space or without support, people don't necessarily have the opportunity to reflect on it or process it in a different way, which is why just adding to whether we or not everybody needs therapy, I would say yes, just because we're not always aware of the safety behaviors that we exhibit sometimes. And also the fact that there are so many other broader systemic factors like social, cultural pressures, they can continue to reinforce these unconscious patterns. So then changing it feels even more difficult because they're so rigid.
No, it's very real.
It's really helpful. And as a personal example, in terms of the safety behaviors that we don't even realize that we're doing it, but we actually do them quite often, is I used to think that I wasn't an emotional person. And I took a lot of pride in that. I'm like, I never cry. I can go through all of these tough situations and remain pretty unscathed. I can problem solve my way through it. And it wasn't until I actually did something called emotion focused therapy, which, by the way, for anyone considering it, it is
Love
brutal.
EFT.
I wanted to avoid every single session
Yeah.
because I knew that I was going to feel a lot of emotions. It was the most uncomfortable thing I've done in my life. I had to do it every other week because the thought of doing it once a week was just too much. And it was only there that I realized how much some of these events had impacted me. And I was crying session after session after session after session. And then I started to feel better. And now it's almost like there was like something that was unlocked, and I will cry at the drop of a hat. And it was so crazy because this thing that was so part of my identity, that I was somehow strong and I never cried, and how I took a lot of pride in that, I can see now how much it was like harming me. And it was a huge blind spot that even being in this field, I didn't realize until I did my own therapy.
It's interesting you say that, because I think, well, I definitely resonate with that, kind of seeing as, well, I don't really cry and I'm not an emotional person, as a bit of a badge of honor. But I think a lot of Albanians, a lot of people in the community would resonate with that also. But it's about thinking,
Absolutely.
to what detriment, what's the unintended consequence of suppressing those emotions, of kind of saying I don't cry, or not emotionally reacting to something. Well, it's just about kind of asking, well, what does that then mean for you in terms of your health generally, not just your mental health, but your physical health as well, if you're kind of storing those emotions in your body and not giving them an outlet.
And for me, one of the things I was noticing at the time, so before I did this kind of therapy, is that my body was always tense and I always had a lot of aches and pains that I couldn't explain. I had seen a lot of doctors. I was diagnosed with like a lot of physical conditions. At some point, because of the pain that I was in, I was taking like 10 to 12 Advils a day. Like that's how bad the physical pain was. And yet I was like, well, I'm strong. I can make it through this pain. I can like get through it. And it wasn't until after therapy, until I processed some of the emotions that I needed to process, that that pain is no longer there. I don't constantly feel so tense all the time. And I didn't realize what relaxation felt like until after therapy, because I thought that state of tension was actually the norm.
I think that's really common. I think that's much more common than we think. I like to use this example with my clients of like sweeping things under the rug. The more you sweep, the more you don't feel. You're essentially pushing all those emotions under the rug, and the pile just gets bigger and bigger. And you step on it, the dirt might move in another area of the rug. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't always just wait there for you to access it, even though it is under the surface waiting. So I'm not surprised to hear that it showed up in ways like physical pain, because if it's not expressed emotionally, then it'll be expressed physically, or it'll be expressed, cognitively. You're overthinking, you're emotionally shut down. Like there's so many other ways that it comes out that we don't know, because we can't link it exactly to the thing that we think that it's related to.
Small meaningful steps that families can take. So I would say that some small steps that we can take, which we kind of already touched on really, but it's simply building awareness. So beginning to notice patterns in how we respond, especially in moments of stress, and just asking ourselves, where might this be coming from? I think that's the first step into bringing those narratives, those meanings that we've made, into our conscious awareness. Another step is opening up conversations within families, if it feels safe to do so, and just naming experiences, even if it's not, even if it's imperfectly. Because I think that can help to reduce silence and shame, and can maybe even help create a sense of shared understanding. But I'm also conscious of the fact that that's not always going to be safe for everyone. And ultimately, I think those small steps will kind of shift the focus from asking, what's wrong with me, to what's happened to me and what do I need to do now. And where possible, I would always suggest seeking support, whether that's through community, cultural or religious practices that may feel comforting to people, professional help, because that can really make a big difference. And we spoke about this idea of healing, and I think healing doesn't have to happen in isolation. I don't think it can necessarily happen in isolation. I think it's much more of a relational process.
For sure. And I'll build on that to give some insight into how we can, as the current generation, help to disrupt this cycle of passing on previous trauma in a way that is helping us build up the community as well. So I get that you kind of mentioned on some of these steps, but I think it's absolutely important to approach situations, for example, confronting our parents, or even just asking them about their past, with curiosity rather than with blame or any kind of criticism. Because, if you imagine being blamed or criticized or attacked in any kind of way for previous behavior, natural instinct is to shy away, is to shut down and not be open to a conversation. So it's absolutely imperative that we approach this with a kind perspective and a curious perspective, because that's actually what it really is to increase awareness of our current state of being and how we can ameliorate this and make it better. And this doesn't excuse any harmful behavior that people have done in the past. I want to be very clear about that. It's just creating a different environment of understanding and opening the door for more compassion rather than blame or silence or resentment that could build up over time. So many younger generations recognize these patterns in their families, but it's sometimes not not enough to ask what happened, but also what might have happened to the specific family members. Not what happened in general, because we know, a lot of us know our history, but what happened to your parents? What happened to your grandparents specifically that could have affected them in however many countless ways? What experiences could they have had, and how could that have shaped the way that they react to the situations at hand? How have they coped, if they have coped at all, with these difficult situations? And how could this have affected the way that they parented or show up in any kind of societal aspect as well? So often these conversations can go a long way, and it can go much more pleasantly if people feel understood for their experiences rather than judged. So at the same time, I think though it's very important for younger generations to set boundaries for some of these things. They don't have to be explicit boundaries, but they can be more internal boundaries of knowing when to, dilute the conversation or maybe step away because it's too painful or too triggering, to prioritize healing in yourself so that you can impart this healing energy onto the person that you're speaking with as well, and hold space and acknowledge that people have had difficult experiences in the past, and sharing those experiences is really difficult on its own as well. So compassion and accountability can coexist, and with these really difficult situations that would help heal our generations, is important to embody both compassion and accountability.
Yeah, I really liked how you phrased that, Ada, where compassion and accountability can both coexist. Because I think when we start talking about understanding some of these systems, a lot of people can feel, well, this person hurt me so much. Does this mean that I have to forgive them? Does this mean that, I have to get back in contact with like the people that have harmed us? And it's not necessarily about that. I think understanding there's this really good book, actually. It's called The Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu. For anyone who is interested in reading it, we can post a link for it. And one of the things that he talks about in the book, it's this idea that forgiveness has nothing to do with like the other person. Forgiveness has everything to do with ourselves and being able to heal for ourselves. And we can call it forgiveness, we can call it something else. It's more so like accepting and understanding rather than, oh, it's okay that you did the thing that you did. And there is something that I see in my own work and in the work that I do with clients, that being able to actually understand why the people that have caused us harm did the thing that they did can actually help the healing, because it can help reduce that anger that we were talking about before. And if we can reduce the anger, then we can actually grieve the things that happen to us. But it's impossible to grieve if we're still in like this anger state. And I think anger, we do very well as a community. I think grieving, we need a little bit of help actually getting there.
So that is really hard work to do. The three of us have been in this field for a long time. So when we speak of these concepts, we can understand, if not personally, kind of from a general perspective of how these changes could take place. And we're very cognizant and understanding of the general population not always having access to these resources. So we understand that sometimes what we say in this podcast could be difficult to implement. So it's important that if you have the resources to either learn more about these concepts and how they affect you, or get in touch with somebody who could help you understand them better and help you understand how to apply them to your life. So, as Arela mentioned earlier, if you need help with any resources, we're here. We have contacts for different parts of the world. If you need to get in touch with a therapist as well, please let us know. Thank you for
Awesome.
joining us here today.
Thank you again. That was such a pleasure having you on
Thank
this
you.
podcast. And I hope we can definitely have you back. I think just having you here, we completely went off script a lot of times, but I think it's because the
It's
discussion
such an
was so
interesting,
interesting.
yeah, it's such an interesting conversation. And thank you, because I feel really proud to be a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you,
Of
Genta.
course.
It's a pleasure having you here.